Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. Today I want to take a few minutes and answer some of the many questions that you guys have for me about keeping and breeding boas. If you're new to this channel, this is the place for everything about keeping and breeding boa constrictors in captivity, so be sure to subscribe to the Brian Boas YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of my upcoming boa videos. I want to thank you guys for all the thoughtful and insightful questions that you've been giving me over the last few months. And whenever possible, I try to answer them in the comments section, but sometimes I can't really give the full answer that I'd like to give. In addition, I get a lot of questions that are repeating. A lot of people have the same types of questions. So I thought I'd do a video where I just answer some of these questions and give a little more of the nuances of the answers that aren't really possible to put in comments. So if you have any questions, please feel free to keep asking the questions, and periodically I'll do a similar video to this. So our first question was one thing that drew you to breeding boas, the fact that they give live birth. I imagine it keeps things a bit easier without having to worry about incubating eggs. Well, that's a very good question. And actually, the fact that boas give birth to live young rather than laying eggs makes it harder to breed them in captivity. And the reason why is because the females are involved in the breeding season for quite a bit longer than an egg-laying snake would be involved. Between the time when I introduce my females to their mates and when they give birth is typically 6 to 9 months, so it's a pretty good chunk of the year. And they have to expend an awful lot of energy in producing these young. So basically, from the time that I pair them up to the time that the females are gravid is typically about 4 to 6 months. And then it's an extra 120 days after ovulation, or about 105 days after the post-ovulation shed. With an egg-laying snake, basically they get paired up, and shortly after ovulation the snake will lay eggs, and then the breeder can incubate the eggs while the female is free to recover and gain back the weight and go on to breed again. With a boa constrictor female, they have to put that additional roughly 4 months or so into the carrying the young and into the gestation period. So it takes an awful lot out of them compared to an egg-laying snake. In addition, with a live-bearing snake like a boa, there are some additional reproductive issues that can arise, like retained slugs and unfertilized products of conception that can cause complications during delivery. And things like this can happen with egg-laying snakes, but in general, they're not as much of a problem. And so when you have an egg-laying snake, the keeper can take the eggs, they can put them in an incubator, and they can precisely control the temperature and humidity to the optimal levels. With a live-bearing snake like a boa, it's up to the female to choose the optimal temperatures, provided they're provided by the keeper. With boa constrictors, you're typically limited to 1 litter every other year because the breeding takes so much out of the females, they have to recover for an entire year and gain back the weight before they go into breeding trials again. With an egg-laying snake, typically you can breed them every year because they have that additional time to recover after laying the eggs. And a lot of pythons and colubrids you can routinely breed every year. Some colubrids you can actually breed 2 or even 3 times a year, such as milk snakes that can double or triple clutch. So I've seen snakes that can do this and have this many babies, and sometimes I thought, well, wouldn't that be great if you could do that with boas? The next question I get quite a bit: should I get a boa as a first snake or a ball python? What's your verdict on a common boa BCI as a first snake? I had wanted a ball python for a few years, but lately have gone all the way over to the side of getting a boa. So the way that I'll answer this is that any boa or any snake that you properly research its husbandry requirements and you're able to provide them can be appropriate for someone that hasn't kept a snake before. Boas do have particular environmental needs, so you need to make sure that you can provide the right heat gradient, the right humidity, the right size enclosure, the right enclosure furnishings, etc. But if you've probably done your homework and you understand what the animal needs, there's no reason that a boa constrictor can't be a good beginner snake. And in fact, within boa constrictors, There are several types that are better for beginners for a number of reasons than others. And I've done videos on this in the past. So check out my video, Best Beginner Boa, if you're interested in a boa for a beginning keeper. But I would also say that if you really want a boa, don't get a ball python or some other kind of snake because you think you need to keep a beginning snake first. Because these animals can live a very long time. They can live several decades. So they might be with you for quite a while. So you might as well get the animal you want just so you're happy with your choice. Our next question is a pretty common misconception about true red-tailed boas. And the question is, are peak saddles a way to identify Suriname red-tailed boas? Or do only top shelf examples have these peak saddles? And so I just wanted to grab this guy. This is a holdback male who you can see displays very nicely peak saddles. But this is probably one of the most widely held misconceptions about true red-tailed boas from Suriname, is that they always have these peak saddles. The fact is only a subset of Suriname red-tailed boas have the peak saddles. Some have round saddles, and they are perfectly pure Suriname true red-tailed boas. In addition, there are several other types of boas, including Boa Constrictor amarali and Boa Imperator, that often will have peak saddles. So you can't use them to diagnose whether something is a true red-tail. In general, the true red-tails do show the most well-formed peak saddles, and they're really popular among true red-tailed boa aficionados. I believe they've been selectively bred for in captivity, so you see them a lot more often than you might in the wild, just because people like them so much. But they're not diagnostic of true red-tailed boas. And in fact, they're not even diagnostic of top shelf examples. If you like the peak look, that might be your top shelf example. But, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and some people might like the round saddles better in their Suriname red-tails. I wanted to finish the question by showing you this guy. So this is another Suriname red-tail that has non-peaked or round saddles. And this guy is actually a full sibling litter mate to the boa I just showed you. So it shows you the extremes that you might see in the same litter as far as the peaking. The parents of these two animals had moderately peaked saddles, not as well defined as the first animal I showed you, but they did have some peaking, unlike this guy. And I actually held back this guy just because I really liked his look. You know, it's very high contrast and bright colors, and I liked the non-peak saddle look as well, and it's a look that I plan to breed for. I know that peak saddles have gotten really popular, but I think we also need to keep the diversity in our true red-tails and also select for lines that don't have the peak saddles. Our next question, do you have any emerald tree boas or rainbow boas? Do you work with Numerals boas or Puerto Rican boas? Hey Brian, are you interested in boas outside of Central America or South America, like Madagascan ground boas, Solomon Island ground boas, etc.? So I'm interested in pretty much all boas, all snakes, and all reptiles for that matter. But I limit my own collection to the animals of the species that used to be considered Boa Constrictor. So this was one species with something like 9 subspecies. It was recently classified as 3 separate species, Boa Constrictor, Boa Imperator, and Boa Sigma. And these are the animals that I work with. Again, I like all animals, actually all animals, including all reptiles. And I will touch on other species from time to time in my videos, but the focus is on these 3 species that are collectively known as boa constrictors. Next question, what is an average sized boa litter? How large was your largest litter? Well, I would say on average, my boas have slightly smaller litters than some other types of boas. The true red-tailed boas tend to have smaller litters of larger babies, and the dwarf boas, like the island boas, also tend to have smaller litters just because they're smaller animals in general. So I would say on average, the size of my litters is about 15 babies. The range of the litters I've had has been anywhere from 3 babies up to 25 babies. And I think that in captivity, these are pretty standard or pretty typical litter sizes. There's a lot of older literature that indicates that boas, the average litter size is like 25 or 30, and all these pictures of like masses of babies that have been born. And while this is possible, this is really not typical. The largest ever boa constrictor litter is somewhere around 80 babies, and these are very large females that just give birth to these massive litters. And while these do occur, they're certainly the exception, not the rule. With the average litter size that I've seen from most boa keepers of locality boas is somewhere around 15 babies or so. The next question, do you name your boas? We named ours Pebbles and Bam Bam. Well, I don't give most of my boas a name as far as a pet name. They all get a number. And to number them, I just take the specific type of boa, such as a locality, and then for the males, I number M1 through whatever. The females, I number F1 through whatever. And that's their official number that differentiates them from all my other boas. I do, however, have a pet name for a few select boas that just stand out to me. For example, that beautiful peaked male Suriname boa we saw earlier, his name is Picasso because, well, he's a work of art. In addition, some boas come to me with names, like this guy. This is a Coups Pastel Colombian boa that I bought off of a good friend of mine, and he came to me with the name Pablo. So I decided to keep the name Pablo, and because he's from Colombia, I added the last name Escoboa in deference to one of Colombia's most infamous citizens. Here's a question about handling your boas. What advice can you give on returning a snake to his enclosure with the snake refusing or fighting to go back in? I always see people struggle with this and just claim that the snake likes being handled. Well, boa constrictors, as you probably know, will often squeeze around something and resist being put back. It's just what makes them feel comfortable and safe. But the secret is you want to support the front half of the boa's body while you gently unwrap the tail. You always have to unwrap from the tail, or else you're not going to be able to get loose of the boa, because they can always tighten with the tail. So if you try to unwrap from the head, it's just going to squeeze harder with the tail. So you unwrap from the tail, and then you want to put your boa in the enclosure on top of an item that makes it feel comfortable, such as a branch or a piece of driftwood or something with a rough texture that the boa can wrap around, because then it will feel safe in its enclosure. And then you want to gently push the head back in. Make sure the head isn't sticking out when you close the enclosure. One thing I've been asked about several times is Instagram. For example, Brian, I'd love to see an Instagram account from you. I know you're into photography. I'd love to see more of your photos of your collection of boas. If you have an account already, please post it here. Also, really, Brian, you should start Instagram. I'd say you'd get 500K followers in less than 5 months. Well, I don't know about that. But I actually do already have an Instagram account. And I set it up recently, mostly out of curiosity, just to see what Instagram is about. If you want to check it out, my account number or my account name is Boa, which I'll post below. But I haven't used it much so far, and I have to say I don't like Instagram just based on the experience of uploading photos, because you can really only upload photos directly from your phone. And my phone has a camera, but it doesn't really work that well. And I produce most of my good boa photos with my Canon DSLRs. I know there's probably hacks where you can upload photos from your camera to the computer, to the phone, to Instagram. But I don't really have time for that with all my snakes and filming these videos and my day job and my family and all the other stuff. The other thing I don't get about Instagram, it's just like pictures, and it just seems like you got people on there with... I just don't get the whole thing. I don't, like YouTube, Facebook, I kind of understand what the point is, but Instagram, I just don't get the point. So if you have any suggestions or any ideas how I could use Instagram to promote this channel and to promote my boas, I'd love to hear it. I will probably continue to post some photos there, but most of my photos I put on Facebook under the Brian Boas account. So if you ever want to see my photos, go to Facebook, go to Brian Boas. You can see them there. Now for a question about crossbreeding. Can you do a video on breeding BCC with BCI boas? What would the outcome be? Is it not smart to do, or is it okay? Are there already certain types of boas like that? Well, there are some people who have crossed different localities of boas, particularly with respect to morph projects. So I'll say first of all, if you have a pure locality boa, it's really a terrible idea to crossbreed it, because you can never get back the pure locality, and because crossbred locality boas have very little interest in the boa market, and people don't want them for their collections. You're going to create these mixed breed boas, and you know, they might be okay as pets, but a locality collector isn't going to want them. That being said, there are some morph breeders who crossed different types of boas into their morph projects. This is actually an albino that it has 25% Guyana BCC true red tail boa. The rest is mixed BI or BCI, common boa. But adding the true red tail into the albino project gives it enhanced colors. It retains its colors longer into adulthood, and it has kind of more intense red in the tail. So personally, I would not probably mix any kind of locality into any of my morph projects. I mean, I have this guy who's 25% BCC, and I'm planning on breeding him with my morph projects. But in general, it's really a bad idea to ever do this with any pure locality boas. You know, morph mixing is still controversial, and you know, some people think it's okay, some people are also against this. So a related question, are there albino true red tail boas? And so the answer to this, I'll answer the question about pure true red tail boas. There have actually been a few true Suriname red tails that have been turned up as albinos. In fact, there were a few that were offered by the Miami or South Florida snake shop called Snakes at Sunset, and they had these Suriname albinos that I think they were getting like 15,000 a piece for them. I don't know if any sold. And there have been a few other pure Suriname albinos which have turned up over the years. I don't know of anyone who's bred them and established a line of pure Suriname albino red tails. That being said, some people have crossed Surinames or Guianas or other true red tails into albino projects, and they produced albinos with varying percentages of true red tail. Like I said, this guy's got 25%. If I was to take him and cross him back to a true red tail and then breed the offspring, the heterozygous offspring, it would increase the percentage. And if you wanted to create a nearly pure albino true red tail, in something like 6 generations you could get something like 98% pure. It would probably be indistinguishable visibly from a true pure Suriname, but it would have that 2% that's not pure. So I'll leave that up to the locality and, you know, the purists out there. I don't think that they would consider 98% pure to be pure, but it would be possible to get a largely Suriname albino just by back crossing. That being said, as you know, the generation time of boas is pretty long, so it would definitely take you a few decades at least to get these high percentage Suriname albino boas. One more question. I believe you would pronounce Kralky the way it is spelled, as in C-A-Y-K. K is generally a term to define a low elevation island, coral reef, or large sandbar in the Caribbean, and is commonly confused with a key. I read a book called The K in grammar school. Well, this is really a semantic question because it's kind of like the old potato, potato, tomato, tomato argument. People can pronounce different words in different ways, and they mean the same thing. The reason I pronounce it Key as in Key West is because I read Vin Russo's book, The Complete Boa Constrictor, where he claims that the correct pronunciation of C-A-Y is indeed Key. And I did a little bit of research, and what I found is that people that are natives of these islands in the Caribbean, they will pronounce it Key. And the way they can tell tourists is that tourists are the ones that pronounce it K. So I'll continue to pronounce it Key as in Kralky boa. And one final question, and this is really a comment. Some of your boas are so gorgeous. I feel guilty for buying one though, since I don't have the capacity to breed at the moment. Well, you shouldn't feel guilty at all, and in fact, most people should actually not be breeding. And you know, a few decades ago when there weren't that many people breeding, the focus in keeping herps was on breeding because there were limited numbers that were available from the wild. But now we have plenty of reptiles in captivity, and it's fairly straightforward to breed many of them. So really the last thing you should be thinking about if you're new to boas is breeding them. And if you're getting into Boas specifically to breed them, it's really not a good idea, and you're highly likely you're not going to be successful because it's very challenging breeding Boas and it takes a very long time. What I would suggest is, if you're new to Boas, get a Boa, get a couple Boas, see how you like them, take care of them, grow them up from a baby to adulthood. And if you're still obsessed with them 5 years later when they're ready to breed, then maybe you should think about breeding them. But by and large, there are plenty of people breeding Boas these days. There are a lot of people that get into it for the wrong reason, and it's perfectly okay to get Boas with absolutely no intention of breeding them. I mean, you wouldn't get a puppy or a kitten with the intention of breeding dogs and cats, or at least most of us would. Please keep the questions coming, and maybe I'll do more of these types of shows in the future on the Brian Boas YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in. As always, shoot me any questions or comments, and enjoy your Boas.